Here in part 2, let's talk about plants invading land, with the expression taken from Neil Armstrong. One small step for algae, one huge step for plant kingdom. Plants moved onto land, probably not into a dry scene like you see here in this desert sand dune, but probably into intertidal locations to begin with, where there was moisture available on a frequent basis. Dry land was likely first colonized by Archaea, cyanobacteria, and unicellular algae. In fact, we can see that today where we begin to look at crust soils. One feature which is common in these Archaea, cyanobacteria, and unicellular algae is their capacity to be active and then to go dormant as they dehydrate. They have what is called desiccation tolerance. This is the capacity to survive a dry period in an inactive state. And that must have been a key feature which allowed organisms to invade land, this capacity for desiccation tolerance. It turns out today, desiccation tolerance is only found in the ancestral species. We don't find desiccation tolerance in the more derived plant species. An example of some of this early invasion would have been the Archaea, cyanobacteria, algae, and mosses that we find in our own desert crusts here in southern Utah. These very complex communities where hyphae from cyanobacteria tend to hold the soil particles in place. Soil crusts dominate many regions of the world, most frequently in the arid to semi-arid parts of the world, from Antarctica through the deserts of the Taklamakan in Central Asia. One of the major components of these biological crusts, so an early invader to land, would be the cyanobacteria. There are some huge advantages to living on land. The first, more light, which means a higher photosynthetic rate, more carbon gain. Second is a fundamentally different rate of CO2 diffusion. Carbon dioxide diffuses 10,000 times faster in air than in water. So the combination of a faster diffusion rate for CO2 and more light would be a tremendous competitive advantage in terms of growth. And some have suggested that early on there wasn't competition for space when plants first invaded land. But there are some serious drawbacks to invading land. The first is an increased UV exposure, which will negatively impact the nucleic acids. The lack of water means that desiccation is a problem. The lack of water makes it more difficult to obtain nutrients, and the lack of water actually makes it difficult to maintain structure. Another disadvantage is that they needed a new dispersal mechanism so that the sperm could go from one plant to the egg of another plant through air if water was not available. Let me come back to this point here about structure, and that is without buoyancy, gravity became a serious issue. And lastly, the temperatures in the ocean and in lakes tend to be buffered, whereas on land we have much more serious temperature extremes. The first plants to invade land were plants such as the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses. One of the features they have in common is that they're all small. Here you see the centimeter scale. They tend to be flat, so most cells are exposed to the external environment. If we begin to look at the initial invasion of plants on land using a tree here, we find that they are derived from the green algae. So the green algae branch gives rise to higher plants. The first higher plants to have arisen are the liverworts, the mosses, and the hornworts. They go by a term called bryophytes. So it's a term that describes a plant which is non-vascular. that it doesn't have a conducting system to move water, nutrients, and food. It's only after the evolution of liverworts, mosses, and hornworts that we see the evolution of more derived forms that are then called the vascular plants. So here's a timeline for the evolution of land plants. We have the sister groups to the green algae, with the first land plants being the liverworts, the mosses, and the hornworts. They arose between 425 and 480 million years ago during a period known as the Ordovician. After that, we saw the evolution of vascular plants. So here we have a clicker question, true or false? Plants invaded land after the Cambrian explosion. The answer is true. The Cambrian explosion was about 542 million years ago, and plants didn't invade land until 480 million years ago. Another clicker question. Did plants invade land after the last snowball Earth? True or false? Again, true, because the last snowball Earth was about 660 to 700 million years ago, and again, plants invaded about 480 million years ago. So long after this last snowball event and long after the Cambrian explosion.